Hi, this is Nee. I'm the Marketing and Communications Specialist at CARE.
I'm Melissa. I'm one of the violence prevention coordinators at CARE, and you are listening to The Narrative Project.
Hello, everyone. My name is Kaeleigh, and today we have a very special episode for you. Melissa and me will not be joining us today for our conversation, but instead we are here with some other CARE staff and amazing colleagues. We're excited to talk through our 6th episode of the Narrative Project within the Zoom meeting room. And before we get into what we'll be talking about today, I'm going to let everyone introduce themselves, their pronouns if they would like, and a quick description of ourselves and Zoom background. And so I can go ahead and start. So again, my name is Kaeleigh Hayakawa. I use she and they pronouns. I have long dark brown hair and I am wearing a red and blue plaid top with long sleeves and have a virtual background of a purple flowering tree in a park.
And I can go ahead and go next. My name is Eli Pascal. I'm the Assistant Director in the CARE office and use the pronouns they and them. My Zoom background is a picture of Aldrich Park on UCI's campus with a bridge in the background and green trees and shrubbery. I'm wearing a light green polo shirt. I am a white non-binary individual.
Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm an MD PhD student at the University of Miami, Miller School of Medicine. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I have long black hair that's tied up in a ponytail, black rimmed glasses, a black sweatshirt with a white t-shirt that has the Beach Boys logo on it, which is one of my favorite bands. And I'm in a white walled room with closet doors and a futon, mostly white colored, with some pillows in the back.
My name is Rasta. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And I have long black hair. I'm wearing a black and gray plaid poncho style top. And I am in my living room. So there's a couple of paintings on the walls and there's some big window behind me with a tree that you can see out. And then another big window to the side of me with my front door.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm very excited to get started into our conversation today. We're going to explore and discuss how biases are formed and then broken down, as well as concepts such as the savior complex, the cycle of socialization, and allyship and what that looks like. With this in mind, we also recognize there are only a few folks in this space discussing those topics. And so we're certainly not going to cover all of the different contexts and definitions. So please keep in mind, this is just a snapshot of a conversation, and we encourage our listeners to delve into these topics with the folks in their spheres as well.
And so now, because we're going to be spending a little more time this episode reflecting on some concepts that are backed up by research, we want to start off by giving a quick overview of these concepts. All of the resources we are pulling from for this episode will be in the description for our listeners to check out, and I'll be sharing my screen for our recording to pick it up if you are tuning in by watching the video as well.
To begin, I'm going to read some definitions of some of the different topics we're going to talk to familiarize both our guests and also our listeners with those things. So I will be looking down to do that so that I get those definitions correctly. We wanted to define the term white savior, implicit bias, and allyship. So to start, the white savior trope has risen out of the humanitarian sector and can connect to Tehu Cole's 2012 The Atlantic article, The White Savior Industrial Complex, to describe someone, particularly white folks who participate in humanitarian work and often use their own privilege to fix underprivileged folks without a larger look at what the root causes of those issues might be. Implicit bias, also known as implicit social cognition or implicit stereotypes, refers to the attitudes or stereotypes that impact our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner and do not necessarily align with the beliefs that we say outright or declare. Allyship is an active, consistent and arduous practice of unlearning and reevaluating, in which a person holding systemic power seeks to end oppressions in solidarity with a group of individuals who are systematically disempowered. Since everyone in some way or another holds systemic power in different areas and lacks it in others, everyone has areas in which they can practice allyship, and we'll spend some time talking about that. It's important to recognize that we're going to be discussing these terms further, and they will mean different things to us, both listeners and the folks that are in the space for the podcast today, especially the word and term ally and what allyship looks like.
So now I'm going to share my screen with those watching this video to see this too. I am sharing The Cycle of Socialization by B. Haro. With this cycle, it shows how we learn different aspects of our culture and social guidelines from various forms of socialization. The cycle of socialization helps us understand the ways in which you're socialized to play certain roles, how we are affected by issues of oppression, and how we help maintain an oppressive system based upon power. The cycle consists of 3 arrows, 3 circles, and a core center. The beginning of the cycle represents the situation into which we are born. We are born without bias, assumptions, or questions. The first arrow represents that our socialization process begins immediately by the rules and the norms that are already in place that we are made subtly aware of, with rewards of conforming and consequences for rebelling. This socialization continues through institutions that help shape our views and beliefs, represented by the second circle. The second arrow shows the way in which we are instilling of ideas, beliefs, and behaviors is reinforced. We are rewarded for conforming to norms and standards and punished for questioning or rebelling against these societal norms. The third circle represents the results of this cycle, both externally and internally. The vernal arrow represents a point where we arrive at a decision to do nothing and continue through the cycle, or make a change or question the cycle. Finally, in the center of the cycle is the core, which holds it together and is represented by fear, misunderstanding, insecurity, and confusion. So now that we have set up the stage for some common definitions and what we are referring to as socialization, we will go ahead and get right into it. So starting off with this first question, just to open our conversation, what are the first thoughts coming to your mind regarding these definitions and the way we are socialized as humans?
When I think about socialization, go to my parents, and I think about, over time have realized that even though they hold certain characteristics that I find problematic, I consider myself to be a progressive person. And I always, when I think about that, credit them, because they had always raised me to think in certain ways regarding whether it be how do I view people who are less economically advantaged than I am, or people who are LGBTQ, which I also am, but like just how I view people who hold different marginalized identities and how I look at why those structures exist. I really credit them. And I think it helps me also when I am talking with somebody who don't think alike. I always consider that they might not have been raised to think that way, and how challenging it is really to undo what we're taught. I could very easily maybe hold different views if I was raised a different way. And I'm very cognizant of that.
I've been reflecting a lot on this lately in terms of my own upbringing, especially with regard to anti-Black racism. And in my culture, I'm Filipino, just for context, and how that's been perpetuated in my world since the beginning, and how structural a lot of these biases really are. I don't know, just made me think about my own upbringing and how hard it is to unlearn and relearn things that you were taught since birth.
I really appreciate both yours, Rasta, and you too, Michelle, the perspectives on that. I think one of my privileged identities is that I identify as a white individual. And I think looking back, I didn't necessarily understand privilege as a kiddo. But when I look back, I think the fact that my mom did not have conversations with me about my identity as a white person is a really good indicator of the privilege that that identity holds. I did not have to consider that in terms of the spaces I moved in and out of growing up. Other identities I hold, yes, I've had to consider those, and those are difficult at times. But in terms of skin color, that wasn't something I needed to navigate in the same way that others did.
I think another thing too that comes to mind when we think about socialization is particularly like the younger generations, things like social media, right? So we're not only getting our messages from one person, right? Even growing up, I didn't only get messages from my parents or my family, obviously. You get messages from all different directions and you have to make sense of them when we're too young to know how to make sense of them yet, right? So we're trying to balance all these different messages that are coming in and messages that maybe are competing messages. We also have to recognize that people are socialized a lot of different ways too, and I, for example, will have friends that have kids and they, often so concerned because they try to teach their children certain things, but then they know that they're also hearing 1,000 different messages every day from social media or their friends or what have you. We just have to recognize that the messages come from a million different places and those are internalized in different ways depending on different factors, but definitely social media as well, especially now.
Something that comes to mind for me when we're thinking about socialization and like the different institutions that play into that part, education, right? We spend the majority of our lives up until I would say like our mid-20s maybe in the education system, whether it's in K through 12 or higher education, and not just our peers, but those in authority and actual education and content that we're taught and the way in which those spaces are set up plays such a huge role in how we're socialized into the various groups and how we see one another and how we see ourselves. So that's something that comes to mind for me as someone too who was homeschooled for a little while and then had this like massive culture shock when I went to a public school and I was like 12 and things were just so different. And I was like, oh my gosh, people are like looking at me so differently. And so I'm being forced to confront like my own identities because of how others are talking to me and about me.
Even in the context of education, what we value and what we judge our students on is super entrenched in a lot of these oppressive institutions. If you think about grind culture, like being a workaholic, which I totally was very early on in grad school, and I perpetuated it, and I valued being busy and like telling everyone I was busy. I mean, that kind of culture is totally rooted in the racial capitalistic culture that we live in America. Your productivity is like your value. I think about that a lot with kids, and especially as someone who is quote unquote high achieving student, quote unquote, like what are we teaching them when we ask them, you better go to school a million hours, then come home and do a bunch of hours of homework and get straight A's and then go to college, the top college, and that's like what we value versus how do you treat others? How do you work in a team? How are you self-critical in a good way in terms of, your own biases? We don't talk about that in education. So even just being in our system, content-wise and structurally, is just really oppressive and honestly sometimes super toxic.
What you just shared, Michelle, reminds me of the conversation Rasta and I had not long ago with a woman of color who works at the Women's Hub, who was saying the messages growing up that she received as a woman of color were work, work, work. Your value is attached to your productivity and don't take time for self-care. I didn't get similar messages growing up. I was provided opportunities to take a break or take a vacation or practice some self-care. And so even just the knowledge of the messages and the difference in messages that folks get as part of their socialization and how that impacts implicit bias and or the savior complex and or how we show up as allies, right? I mean, it's all so intertwined, and unpacking it, I feel like, is almost a lifelong process.
I was reminded of that conversation too, Eli. And also I wanted to kind of build off what I was hearing, at least Kaeleigh and Michelle saying, in terms of in the education system, even the curriculum is socializing, right? What they choose to include, and not even just what they choose to include, but what do they choose to leave out? Like, what is that telling us? You know, when we're serving students that are so diverse, but we're discluding their history from what we teach, or we're discluding their, I'm pretending like that's a word. Is that a word? It is now. We're leaving out, you know, in English, like what are the books we're reading? Not having an education that is inclusive or representational, and how that also socializes us a certain way to look at certain groups as being more worthy of paying attention to than others, right? Or being more worthy of listening to. We can't take for granted that students are picking up on that and they see that. We can't just, you know, pretend that they don't notice. They're smart and people know when they're not seen. So I think it's something that we really need to pay attention to. How many hours do students spend in school a day or a week? That's like a vast majority of their time. It's like sleeping in school, right? It's like, that's a lot of their day. So we really do have to think about what are the messages that they're getting in those environments.
It seems like understanding how those messages get tied into environments might also impact how showing up as an ally looks. And so I'm wondering, what does being an ally mean to everyone in this space? What does it look like for you?
For me, being an ally, I think, requires that you examine your own privilege. Most people, I should say, have some level of privilege. And I think it takes a lot of introspection and theory and praxis to really not only understand it and come to an end, but continue to learn and relearn again what kind of power you hold in your identity and how you can harness it. For me, it's really just been, I don't want to say self-critical, because I feel like we all need to be more compassionate to ourselves and each other. I don't want to say it like that, but just really being, I guess, thoughtful and introspective about like what privileges I hold. You know, I'm a woman of color, but I'm not a Black person. I'm cisgendered. I'm a thin person. I'm an abled person, a neurotypical person. So I think just being really self-reflective on what you hold, and then truly trying to shape the space around you to be inclusive in all dimensions. And then I think self-compassion and compassion for others is very key, because I think a lot of people have told me they feel scared to say the wrong pronouns. They feel scared to use certain terms because they don't know what they mean. And I think most people try, and I'm not saying intention is everything, but I'm just saying it's important to have self-compassion when you're learning, and then also have compassion for others. Most people, I like to think, are trying to be good allies. They're not trying to be antagonistic. So those are the things that come up for me when I think of allyship.
I think when I think of allyship, I think of a couple of things first and foremost. First for me is just the importance of listening more than anything else. I think it's really showing up for people how is meaningful for them and not being prescriptive. And then another aspect of allyship that I think is so important to remember is that really the motivation has to be about whoever it is that you are being an ally to. It is about essentially, I think at the core, seeing the humanity in somebody and just wanting people to be treated, and it sounds kind of hokey, but really just wanting everybody to be included and be treated with, you know, justly, and be treated fairly and be treated equitably, and not doing it with any expectation for receiving a pat on the back, right? Or receiving acknowledgement, just doing it because you really in your core believe that it is the right thing to do, regardless of like what you might receive back. And if somebody says thank you, then okay, right? Like, but not doing it with any expectation.
I like that you brought that up, Rasta, the idea of like allyship in different spaces. And I'm wondering if you all have thoughts about, does allyship look different in certain spaces, and if so, how? One of the things I was thinking was allyship can be directional, right? Do I need to step forward? Do I need to step back? Do I need to step to the side? And do spaces impact those decisions or observations?
Something that comes to mind for me when I'm thinking of the allyship piece and how it might look different in different spaces. So I think for me, allyship is using, not just acknowledging those privileges and that power that you hold based on the intersections of all the identities you have, but using that power and that privilege for the advantage to uplift other folks. So I think it has to like kind of go beyond that just acknowledging piece and to actively using it. There was an article I read that used the phrase accomplice, not ally. And so I'm thinking of like in these different spaces, like if I was to be an ally to someone, I think it depends on where I'm holding power. If I'm in a space where I'm not holding power, then maybe my positionality as an accomplice or an ally looks different in what I would do. Maybe it's a standing side by side with them in that moment. But if I'm in a space where I hold power, then that's a moment for me to utilize that power and to step back and uplift the other person, right? Or to use that power to dismantle a system or a barrier for them in a way that they aren't able to.
I agree with that, Kaeleigh. And also, I just wanted to clarify one of the things that I said allyship means to me is listening. And just to clarify that for me, that means listening to what it is, where if you're an ally to somebody, for me, like regarding that aspect of their identity, they are the expert in their life regarding that aspect of their identity and what they need and how they want people to practice allyship. So whatever is meaningful for them, and listening to that and showing up for them in the ways that are meaningful for them and that you're able to do, right? So I think one of the other aspects of allyship is that it can look different. People have access to different ways of being able to support. So maybe for somebody that is going to a demonstration or protest and putting their body there in the front of the line, maybe that's what somebody is able to do. For somebody else, it might look different, right? It might be donating to an organization. For somebody else, it might be uplifting a voice. For somebody else, it might look like being willing when they're seeing problematic behavior to being willing to being that person to say, hey, like when you said this, right? Not leaving that labor to the person who you're being an ally to. I don't want people to think just because they practice one type of allyship that means that their allyship isn't meaningful or that they're not able to participate, because people can participate in different levels based on whatever access that they might have and the resources available to them. And like Kaeleigh was saying too, the positions that they have or like the different ways that they might be able to utilize their privilege to uplift somebody else.
I'll give Kaeleigh a little bit of a shout out here, because I know the folks listening and or viewing might not be able to see the notes that we're putting in the chat, but Kaeleigh just put that allyship and activism have multiple routes. And I love that because, again, that directional piece that I was talking, but Michelle, you also talked about sometimes people are really scared about making mistakes. And one of the things I've learned with some of my marginalized identities is that people, like you said, do want to try. They don't necessarily intend harm. And so instead of calling out, that notion of calling in to help them understand so that they can do better and they can figure out what their route to allyship and activism looks like, and they can work with others who hold different privileged identities to kind of map out those routes and do the work together. And so I really value that those two pieces together are connecting for me. So thank you, Kaeleigh, Melissa, and Rasta too.
Yeah, I mean, I only mention that because I think we all want our society to be progressive, right? We all want to model what the behavior that we want society to model and to reflect. And sometimes I worry about those people who really, I'm thinking of a particular friend I have who told me, she said that she knows it's not right to not speak out about anti-Black racism, but she has a lot of family members who, live in a certain area in the country and they have a certain viewpoint. My initial instinct, honestly, was like, so what? Say something, do something. It's wrong to tolerate that. And then I had to correct myself and say, that also is like, that's like their family, that's their dad, that's their mom, who have these beliefs that are so antithetical to her beliefs. That is so difficult. That's so challenging. How can we bring them forward? How can we help them progress? I feel like the COVID era has hopefully made people a little more compassionate in terms of all of this. Like, we've all had a window into each other's lives with Zoom. We've all had different challenges. I just think we want our society to be progressives, which necessarily means that we need people to change. Compassion goes a long way in terms of educating people, the people in the middle who want to learn, but maybe don't know how. And I think that goes into what Kaeleigh was saying about taking action. If you're in a privileged position and someone wants to learn and you don't want to, like, for example, for anti-Black racism, maybe I should put that on me to educate a person some of the history instead of sending them to my friend who's had to explain this a million times. You know, putting the burden on yourself to help people get there when you're in a privileged position, I feel like is helpful. Although I've gotten mixed feedback on that too. That's just my personal thing. I'm like, if I'm in a privileged position to do that, I do not mind doing that, knowing that other people have the burden of doing that and they shouldn't have that burden.
Yeah, this conversation had me think of the intention versus impact piece. I know that people have different, obviously, opinions on that. For me, impact is very important, you know, kind of regardless of what the intent was. I think the intent can shape how or if or who might want to respond. What the intervention is might differ depending on what the intent was, but I think impact is impact, right? So harm is harm, regardless of whether or not I meant to harm you. If the end result was that what I said or did was harmful, then I have to accept that. I have to accept that, and I have to reflect on that. Not use that as a reason to say, well, when I try to be an ally, it's just like not received, or they said I'm doing XYZ thing wrong. Okay, so for me, it's like if somebody that you're trying to be an ally to actually takes the time to give you feedback, like when you've maybe in their mind done a misstep, because also people are not a monolith, right? So maybe something that I'm a queer woman of color. I have immigrant parents that my family was undocumented for over a decade and things. So I hold certain identities, you know, and come from a certain background. And if somebody takes a misstep, or if somebody does something with me that I think, this is like questionable, that's for me, right? Like somebody else might not have a problem with what they said or did at all, right? So it really just depends on the person and the situation. But I feel like in times where I've practiced allyship and it is not well received, I have to take a look at that. Yes, it's a learning process and a teaching process, but whose job is it to do the teaching, right? How can we access information that's already out there? And certainly there's people who are part of that marginalized identity who are more than willing and happy and want, you know, to do the teaching. And that's beautiful and that's fine too. But we also have to understand that it can be really tiring and exhausting, and some people don't want to do it at all, and that's okay too. We just have to respect where people are with that and how they want to engage with people who are allies, because it can be tiring. It can be really exhausting. It can be a lot of emotional labor. And I don't know that I have a good answer for how should that be approached or who should do the teaching, because again, if somebody is wanting to and willing to do that, then they should be able to do that without the person who's receiving that education feeling like they're being burdensome either. There are people who I value a lot, who I'm willing to engage in those conversations with, right? And who I'm willing to say, hey, when you said that, because the relationship is valuable enough to me that doing that labor is worth it.
Tying together kind of what Michelle was saying before and then some of what Rasta was saying, I think it ties really beautifully back into like the beginning part of our conversation on education and how we're socialized. And I think those pieces of being afraid to make mistakes and not being able to be okay when you're wrong. So often these conversations require so much emotional labor because the person on the other end isn't willing to understand what they did wrong or why it was wrong, or that they even hurt someone because they don't understand that the impact and the intent are different. and that they both hold value, but the impact you can't get rid of just because you didn't mean to cause that harm. And so I'm thinking now about that socialization, how we're taught these values of like, it's not okay to be wrong because there are consequences when you're wrong, and it's not okay to be corrected.
Yeah, that's really insightful. And it is true. People get very defensive when they're corrected, myself included. Obviously, I'm not special in any way, shape, or form. I think it's a really important part of being an ally is knowing that you're going to be wrong. That's what I told my friend that I was telling you all about. I was like, you have to be okay with being wrong and saying, I'm sorry that I said that, period, or I'm sorry that I didn't stand up for you. It is in our culture, to be, I know I'm centering my experience as a medical student. In medicine, it's very common to not want to be wrong. Of course, you don't want to be wrong when it comes to patient care, but in the learning process, you have to be wrong. You're a student. What you said reminded me of that and how that behavior leads to a lot of really toxic environments in medicine specifically, but it's very reflective of our culture in terms of needing to always have the answer.
I think also an aspect of that is people who hold certain privileged identities, right? Those privileged identities that we hold. So say, for example, with whiteness, you can be a wonderful, beautiful person who is working towards, racial justice, things of that nature. But by virtue of your whiteness alone, you benefit from your whiteness just by virtue of your whiteness. It doesn't matter if you're a good person or, it has nothing to do with what you're doing as a person. It's just almost a passive thing that you are benefiting from that in some way. You can apply that to any privileged identity. And when we are considering ourselves allies or our allies, I shouldn't say considering, when we're practicing allyship, I think it could be hard to reconcile the fact that we're trying so hard to do good and to create progress, and we're still passively benefiting from our privilege regardless. And I think it can be hard to just reconcile those two things. When we're trying to practice allyship, it's a learning process along the way. It's really easy to just take it personally in that way when it's not meant to be. It's not meant to be a personal attack. It's really just meant to show somebody like, look, I actually recognize that you're trying to do this, and this, I'm trying to, that we can all be better.
Rasta's point is really important, I feel. People tend to think that it is a personal attack. I come from a public health perspective because that's what I study. If people understand that a lot of these things are structural, and by I think a lot of people are talking about structure, right? They're talking about institutions, and it's very vague. But understanding what that means, I think really helps you reconcile what Rasta was saying, right? Is it me? No, it's not you as an individual. The history of anti-Black racism is a really good example of what structural means. If you look at the historical data, if you look at history, the entirety of our economy and the birth of this nation was written in law and policy to oppress Black people. That's structural. It really permeates our culture completely. If there's a policy that does that, it tells people, it trickles down to our economy, it trickles down to our society, it trickles down to our culture, our education. That's what I think that's what's meant by structural. I could be misunderstanding, but that's how I understand it. Benefiting from that means that you're complicit in the culture that is structurally oppressive. And it's really, really hard to realize that we're all really complicit if we hold these privileged identities. Honestly, in my view, in a way, it's not personal. Like if it's not personal, if you're a white person to say that you've benefited from whiteness, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. It just means there is this structure in our society that values that.
We've talked about the structural stuff. We've talked about socialization. The educational system and how that contributes to these ideas and concepts. So I think we sort of have a sense about how biases are formed, but if folks want to toss some more ideas out there related to that, but also the idea of how do we then break them down? And I think that goes to some of what Rasta was saying about evaluating and then relearning, right? And Michelle, earlier in our time together, you talked about like that examination and being really intentional about stepping back. So I'm just wondering what folks think about that concept for biases.
When we think about the fact that often we don't always even know what all of our biases are until we're confronted with like a situation, right? I think it's really important to think about, like, pay really conscious attention then when we do become aware of it, to pay specific conscious attention to that. And I can give an example actually that started after I started at UCI. In my head, I had an idea of what kind of student is it that goes to like a UC school, right? I just assumed that they came from a family that also had a college education background. And then when I was working on a report, I was looking at some numbers and I realized that almost half of the undergrads at UCI are first generation students, which means neither parent has a college degree. And I was really struck by that. I was really surprised by this. And I had to think about, like, why was I surprised by that? What did that mean about who I thought was like the demographic of the student, that goes to a UC school? And I had to sit with that. And I was, I think it's a beautiful thing. I wasn't expecting it to be such a high number. And now I think it's like a point of pride, but I remember actually thinking, oh, am I reading that number right? Or is it trying to tell me something else, and I was like, oh no, it's really 48% of undergrads. I think over 50% of the graduating class last year were first gen students, which I think is incredible. But it was an example of an implicit bias that I had that I didn't realize that I held until I was presented with that number. And then when I realized that, it has caused me actually to kind of approach the students that I work with differently and look at the student body differently, like a more open-minded, and just like with not making assumptions about who they might be. And it makes me able to provide just better services for them. I saw there was like a symposium about first gen students. So I like started seeking out those types of opportunities. But that's an example for me of a more recent type of bias that I became aware of that I had no idea that I held until I was confronted with it. It can be uncomfortable, right? Because we all like to think, oh no, I don't have. So I think once we realize, oh no, everybody has biases, we all have them. We all have them. And some of them we're aware of and some of them we're not aware of, but we all have them. It's just human to have them, right? But when we become aware of them, to not shy away from them, but just to really sit with them and try to figure out, okay, where does that come from? Like, just spend some conscious time with that so we can unlearn.
That's such a good example of how on the individual level we challenge ourselves. That was such a nice example. Thank you for sharing that. For me, changing bias, I would love to think that if we try to dismantle some of these structures, bias can also permeate again into kind of our consciousness or subconsciousness. Now I don't know. Now I got to look it up, Rasta. I'm confused now in a good way. Now I'm going to learn about it anyway. But I think dismantling the structures is important in order to change bias kind of in the long term, like the long game, not on an individual level, like on a group level. And it's kind of daunting to think about because that requires bigger things, right? Like, for example, sorry, I'm just pulling examples from my life because I don't have good other examples off the top of my head. But like in academic medicine, there's a really huge parity of women in leadership positions and obviously women of color in leadership positions. And so, sort of demanding a lot of us at the student level have been asking, chairs of departments, i.e. straight cisgender white dudes, why aren't there more women who are tenured professors? Why aren't there more Black tenured professors in your department? I've gotten advice like down the road when you negotiate for a job, ask like, do you pay your women and people of color the same as, the white men in your department? I think that's a structural way we could, that's not that specific example, but I think changing the structural barriers can hopefully help kind of in the long game of changing bias in our own individual lives. I think Rasta's approach is the way I try to do it anyway when confronted with a bias I didn't know I had, just sitting with it and making sure that I truly change my perspective. But I think structural changes are needed as well, in addition to those individual changes.
I was participating in a module that we're doing with the Office of Inclusive Excellence at UCI. And they had a module this morning where they were talking a bit about implicit bias as well. And they showed a TED Talk, and I apologize, but I can't think of the name of the person, but they were talking about implicit bias, and we're talking about, just essentially if somebody's showing quick images of like a Black person and words, they're more inclined to associate the picture of the Black person with negative words and positive words with pictures of white people. They were saying when Black people did it, they were more likely to prefer white people 50% of the time, and white people were more likely to prefer white people 70% of the time. And this was all things that were going on. They didn't have really time to think. It was just really quick associations. And they gave a suggestion that then you have to really, it was actually funny the way that they put it, so they said, we don't want you to be colorblind or not. Look, they were like, we want you to stare at the picture of the Black person, really look at the picture, right? We want you to look at pictures of positive, just successful, anybody that you associate, positively who are Black, and really just notice them and retrain your brain to, consciously kind of retrain your brain, not automatically associate the picture of the Black person with a negative word. And again, not that it was 100% of the time, it was just more likely, right? So they were like, if this is what you're doing kind of underneath the surface, then above the surface, when you are able to really be intentional about it and try to make those connections, intentionally, that hopefully would work to help address some of those implicit biases that we have.
I think that our conversation has reached a really good stopping point. I love everything that we've talked about so far, from how we're socialized by our parents, by our society, by our institutions, such as education, how our biases are formed, how we can break them down in very intentional ways, and how we can recognize them and reconcile and wrestle with those emotions of recognizing these biases and then confronting them, either ourselves or with our community behind us. And so I want to thank everyone in this space for such a wonderful, productive conversation. We're so thankful for you being here, and we're really excited for the next episode of the Narrative Podcast.
Thanks for tuning into the Narrative Project Podcast.
We hope you all enjoyed the dialogue we had today.
Please remember, should you need support from the CARE office, please call us at 949-824-7273 or email us at care@uci.edu. Our services are available to UCI students, staff, and faculty members Monday through Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. PST.
The UCI Counseling Center is available at 949-824-6457 and offers 24-hour access to counselors by phone.
And for Waymakers 24-hour hotline, they can be contacted at 949-831-9110 in South Orange County or 714-957-2737 for North Orange County, and they can provide resources and referrals for survivors of sexual assault.
Human Auction's 24-hour hotline is available at 877-854-3594 and provides resources, safety, and support for individuals experiencing relationship abuse.
For those outside of Orange County, the National Sexual Assault Hotline can be reached at 1-800-656-4673 or through online chat at rainn.org. That's RAINN.org for resources and referrals for survivors of sexual assault.
And the National Domestic Violence Hotline can be reached at 1-800-799-7233 or through online chat at thehotline.org. That's thehotline.org for resources and referrals for survivors of individuals experiencing relationship abuse.
If you enjoyed listening to this episode, please be sure to share it with someone you know and join us for our next conversation. Bye for now.